dealing today with a subject that the press has covered massively over the last months, last couple of years, in fact. Challenging issues for the UK and headlines about various aspects of water almost every day. A lot of public interest, and it's a subject that affects all of us, obviously. Now, when we were planning this, the idea was that we would have some informed debate rather than just totally emotive assertions about villains and rogues and so on. It is, though, a very complex issue that embraces all sorts of themes: science, politics, economics, engineering, planning, health, recreation, sociology, even art, I dare say, although I think today we're probably not going to engage with that. We're dealing with something which is highly political. In Britain, we have a water management system which is partly privatised and partly not. And we have some very big questions about the challenges we're facing, particularly about who's going to pay to sort it out. Now, my name's Carolyn Roberts. I was the first Gresham Professor of Environment here, formerly an academic and a consultant, now only a consultant on water and environmental issues. And some of you may be familiar with the legal case that's started up now about sewage spills, which I'm the front person for that, looking at the water companies' responsibilities for sewage spills. But today, out of this complexity, I've selected 3 themes of interest: water supply, which we're going to look at before lunch, flooding, and then water quality in rivers. And we've been very fortunate enough to assemble some absolutely expert panels, very, very well qualified people. And I'm very grateful to them for offering to do this. Some people have already said to me, some of them to put their heads above the parapet. We've got representatives from academia, water company, citizen groups and charities, engineers, farming, and a number of people with several hats. We don't have anybody here from government, not for want of trying, but some of you, I'll just set the scene with that one. Earlier this week, there was a very interesting article in some of the specialist press when Lord Goldsmith was claiming that the Treasury had resisted tougher measures on reducing sewage pollution in rivers during the passage of the Environment Act through Parliament, in 2021. And some of you may know who was head of the Treasury at that time. Any guesses? It was Rishi Sunak. So despite the opposition to those changes by the Duke of Wellington in the House of Lords, the current government did actually restrict the attention being paid to sewage pollution in the Environment Bill. So, although we don't have anybody from government here, I'm hoping perhaps that as we go through, there will be commentary on the government's perspectives on this. Now, we're going to kick off by looking at the general theme of water supply. And we've got 2 excellent specialists with us today. We've got Professor David Butler, there on the left, who's Director of the Centre for Water Systems at the University of Exeter, and tells me that he's half retired, but he's still working 5 days a week, I think, on similar topics, and he's about to have the 5th edition of his book on urban water systems out, urban drainage coming out. And we've also got James Curtis, who has a very long title. He's head of leakage, asset strategy and capital delivery at Affinity Water, which is a water supply company that's in the southeast and east of England mainly. Now, challenges for water supply. It's hard to know where to start, but just to put a few things in perspective, climate change is clearly a big issue for water supply. We are facing drier summers, and no doubt people will talk about that in a minute or two. We are in a country where housing is being developed, the population is still rising, and people living in more households than they used to as well, which affects water consumption. And there are likely to be shortages of water unless we can find solutions. Now, there are a number of possible solutions. I don't imagine that we're going to have time to get through all of them this morning, but I think there are basically 4. We could use less, and we could have, indeed, we've seen water companies exhorting customers to use less water, or charging more for water at certain times, or encouraging the use of water-saving devices. We could use our water smarter. We could shift it around the country from wetter to drier areas. We could build more storage, and some of you may well be aware that since the privatization of the water companies in 1989, I think there have been no major new reservoirs constructed since then. So we could build more storage, and we could stop leakage from the pipes, which would also save us some water. So those are the key challenges. We are short of water in this country at certain times, and something needs to happen. Something needs to be done about it.
I'm going to start with how I see the situation for our water supply in the UK. I see it as a balancing act, and it's a balancing act that has gone out of balance, actually. It's a balance between supply and a balance, on the other side, demand. And that supply-demand balance is under pressure. So Carolyn has introduced some of these. I'll just go a little bit further with thinking about what are those pressures on demand, for example. Well, what do we mean by demand? That's the water that we use, you and me. It's the water that's used by industry, by commerce, and we can also think of the environment as a user of water as well. So what are the pressures? Yes, population growth is definitely a pressure. I looked up the numbers before coming today. Currently in the UK, we have a population of 68 million. And by 2050, it's predicted to go up to 72 million. That's 4 more million people in the next 25 years. And I assume those 4 million will require water to drink and use. On a personal or a local level, our water use per person, per capita, is more or less flatlining, actually. The amount of water we use is similar to our peers in other countries in Europe, perhaps a little bit higher, but it's not going down quickly enough, I don't think. Another pressure on demand, of course, is pipe leakage. It is still too high, at about 20%, but it is on a downward trend, and that downward trend does need to continue. Climate change is another pressure on demand. Yes, the models do tell us quite a complex picture, actually. They present quite a complex picture. Generally more extreme events, but also as part of that, hotter, drier summers, yet warmer, wetter winters. So we're both drier and wetter, if you can get your head around that. Just think back to 2022. James and I were talking about this just now. We experienced the hottest summer on record in England. And that heat wave really stressed our system. And we saw certain water companies really struggling to supply their customers during the heat wave. And then the environment. You may not think about the environment as having a demand on water, but it does. And we would argue that river abstractions, we take a lot of our water from rivers, needs to be reduced because we need to protect our water courses. We need to protect the habitats within our water courses. Think of it the other way around as well. Our reservoirs release flow, so-called compensation flow. We need to keep our rivers flowing. And what we want for that is increased flows downstream into our rivers. So both of those are demands as well. On the supply side, rainfall, of course, is our major driver of supply, both in the short, medium, and long term. And then as part of that, we have all the infrastructure involved of abstracting water, storing water, and the infrastructure to get that water to our taps. And yes, climate change is having an impact on demand, but it's a bit harder to sort out, really, because those drier summers are going to pressure our reservoirs. I think we can all agree with that. And yet, how is that balanced off against the wetter winters? because we've just lived through the wettest winter on record, actually. I live in Devon, and I checked the water levels in my local reservoirs in the southwest, 100% full. Whereas last summer we had a temporary usage ban for 2 years in the southwest. So this is what we're faced with. It's a complex situation with lots of uncertainties. And frankly, our resources are not keeping pace with these increasing demands at the moment, static or even declining. So how big is the problem? Can we put some numbers on it? I think we can put some numbers on it. If we go out to 2050, the projected water supply demand deficit is, I'm going to throw a big number at you, 4,800 megalitres per day. So that's the gap projected to 2050 between supply and demand in a negative way. What does that number mean? It's about 1/3 of the current UK supply. So we supply about 15,000 megalitres per day. So we need to find an extra 1/3 over and above what we use at the moment. And even if we look to 2030, just 5 years away, the deficit's predicted to be about 1,300 megalitres per day, UK-wide. So what needs to be done then? I think that's what we're going to talk about today. The approach typically adopted is a twin-track approach, and I certainly support that. What that means is, if you look at supply and demand, the current water resource management plans produced by the companies and the government show that almost 2/3 of the water needed in 2050 is going to be reduced through reducing demand. Only 1/3 by the infrastructure development. And of that 2/3, probably half and half leakage control and water efficiency. Very challenging in my opinion. On the demand side then, what are we doing? Well, the government's committed to a legally binding target of reducing per capita consumption from 145 litres per person today. That's what it is currently, 145. As I say, not too far away from our European peers, that one. Down to 110 litres per person today by 2050. So that's what government is pledging. Less clear about how government is going to achieve that, mind you. Metering is one aspect. I think in the UK we're up to about 60% of households metered, something like that roughly. If you meter a household, roughly there will be a 15% reduction in demand. You can get a bit of bounce back after people forget they're being metered, but it's roughly 15%. And then there's a push to introduce more smart meters, actually. So that's a potential approach. And smart meters, I think we're way off that at the minute. What's my number? 10%-ish, maybe got smart meters. So a long way to go. All sorts of ideas. Carolyn mentioned a few about how to improve on the demand side. Water efficiency labelling of appliances is due to be mandatory by 2025. Bit unclear what effect that will have, but hopefully that will reduce demand. There are standards for new developments, how they should behave, and also improvements to the building regulations and the water regulations. Variable tariffs. You might have a water company that gives you a lower cost on your water supply off-peak, that sort of thing. Public campaigns, and then lower water use appliances within the house. Some of you may have come across an NGO called Waterwise. Waterwise have developed a strategy, actually, to show how water efficiency measures in combination can reach a saving of 1,500 megalitres a day. That's the 2030 target. So at least on paper, it can be done. And then the other major thing on the demand side is leakage control. I'm going to leave James to tell us a bit about that later on, not steal his thunder. What is proposed currently on the supply side then, again looking at the water resource management plans, the most up-to-date ones, I picked out these numbers. There are 7 new large reservoirs proposed. We haven't had any for a very long time. 2 reservoir enlargements, many intercompany schemes, transfer schemes, 5 recycling schemes, and 4 new desalination plants, including 2 in one or 2 possibly in Cornwall, near to where I live. So just coming to the end-ish of what I'm going to say right now, what are my main concerns? I've got 4. I thought I'd stop at 4, actually. So number 1, scale. Think about it. There's a lot to be done. We're working under significant uncertainty about its effectiveness and, frankly, whether we're doing enough. Second concern is pace. Not only is there a lot to be done, it needs to be done quickly. 2050 is, tomorrow almost, isn't it? It's not far away at all. Thirdly, responsibilities. There are a lot of stakeholders involved. I mean, the obvious ones, government, regulators, water companies, and us, communities, let's call it. And we all have a role to play. And my final one is resilience. And by that, I mean there's lots of uncertainty in our inputs and outputs in this scheme, lots of variability. How do we build resilience to it? And maybe we can talk about that later, exactly what I mean. So my final point is my own research work, which I thought I would mention that's relevant to today's discussion. 3 elements. One is we've worked over the years on a lot of innovative water-efficient household appliances, working with inventors and entrepreneurs, actually. We might have a chance to talk a bit about that. I'm also very interested in the links between water and energy. And can we save both water and energy? Can we do it simultaneously? Do they interact with each other, or what? And the third area that we're interested in is developing multifunctional interventions or multi-benefit interventions. Can we solve more than one problem with the same bit of kit? Let's put it like that. So that's all I want to say at this point in time, so thank you very much.
I'm James Curtis, Head of Leakage for Affinity Water. It's a bit of a bizarre title. It doesn't transfer very well outside the water industry. My family do tend to have a bit of a chuckle at that kind of thing, leakage. I'd just like to say thank you to Carolyn and Gresham College for letting me come and speak. I'm disappointed that other water companies that may have been invited didn't come and have a debate. I think it's important that we lean into the challenges, have those debates. Only by those kind of actions are we all going to come up with what the solutions may be for the future. So it's disappointing. But David covered pretty much a lot of what I was going to say. And I don't disagree with anything that David said. We've got an increasing challenge between supply and demand. And we've got to work out how do we do that. So it said drier future. And like I say, David said, he doesn't feel it's been very dry for the last sort of 9 months. I think June was the last time last year we saw the sun. And it's certainly been very wet since. In Affinity Water, we've certainly had significant amounts of rainfall, way over long-term averages. But the previous year, we had the 40-degree heat, very little rainfall. So what is that kind of doing to the water supply position and the demand position? So certainly we know when it gets warmer, people use more. Demand does go up. We all like to get out in the gardens. We've got to, watering plants, etc. We certainly see an upwards pressure on other kinds of usage. My favourite's been you see these kind of pools now that you can buy quite relatively cheaply, which people put in. There's all sorts of water-using pieces of equipment. My favourite being the unicorn that you plug into your hose pipe and it sprays water everywhere. And these products are becoming cheaper, so we can clearly see there is a link between warmer weather and people's discretionary usage. That puts a lot more pressure on our supply systems. They've been designed with certain capacity in mind, but as people use more and the population increases, David referred to 4 million people by 2050, we're expecting roughly around 1 million of that within our supply area, which is about a 25% uplift. So, the systems that we have in today may not deliver what people need and want tomorrow. Also, David mentioned the rainfall collection. So our systems are designed around our historical patterns of rainfall, and we're certainly seeing a significant change. Long gone as the drizzle that we used to get through the autumns and the winters, and we are seemingly getting these more heavier downpours, more flash water events. And collecting that proves a bit more of a challenge. It can be hitting dry soil, so you get a lot more runoff, so you're not getting the saturation, you're not getting the collection in the reservoirs. So our collection systems need to look at how can we cope with the future impacts of climate change. And as David said, we are duty-bound to protect the environment. The environment is a demand on water resources, and we need to leave more in there to protect the environment that we've got. Certainly in Infinity Waters area, we've got 10% of the UK's chalk streams in our area. They're very, very important and significant habitats, and we need to ensure that we continue to protect them. So it's that pressure on demand is going to be a problem, and the supply system. So what can we do? David pointed out, there's two sides to the coin. You can affect the supply, or you can affect the demand, and in reality, it's a combination of the two. So supply, it's about kind of more, how do we capture the water differently? Can we put more storage in place so when we do get the heavier rainfall, it's there for the drier periods? Can we reuse water, move water around the network? We've got an interesting scheme potentially using the Grand Union Canal to transfer water down from the West Midlands down into the southeast. And generally more connectivity around between water companies. I think traditionally water companies have thought very much siloed about their area, and we've been forced to open up and think of a wider interconnectivity across the UK. But the issues with those kind of things is they are slow moving. Reservoirs not being built for a number of years. Planning and consultation periods on things like that are very extensive. And they're capital investment heavy. You are building things, that does come at a cost. So they do take time. So the other side of the coin is the demand. On demand options, we can be more agile, and it can potentially be more cost effective. Another part of our requirements is to consider affordability of our plans to customers, and we continue to make sure water is affordable for all in the future. So we're heavily looking at how do we affect behaviour. Metering was mentioned, so we have a programme of installing meters because people just become naturally more conscious about what they use. And the next big thing then is smart metering, so akin to what you would get with our gas and electricity meters. We're going to see water meters giving us more insight and more information available to consumers to understand what they're using, how they're using, how they can become more efficient. We do things like home water efficiency checks, so we will come free of charge to people's homes, check, is your plumbing okay? How are you using water? How can we help you to reduce? And we've some big behavioural change campaigns, things like Save Our Streams, which is really focused on the environmental impact on those chalk streams and asking our customers to help us in protecting those. And then you get my bit, which is my area of expertise, which is leakage. I'm very much a practitioner in the leakage space. I've been in this space for around 20 years. So I've seen very much a lot of change in that time over leakage. It has been reducing over that time, and it has now started to accelerate because of the supply-demand position, which means fantastic. We're investing more and more in leakage reduction. To give you kind of numbers around that, so in Infinity Water, leakage is around 15% of all the demand that we have, and that's 150 million litres a day. If we had zero leakage, that would actually account for another 700,000 population increase. We're expecting 1 million by 2050. We could accommodate 700,000 at today's usage levels if we achieved zero leakage. So there is a big drive to how do we get to zero leakage in the industry. But at the moment, we've committed to at least a 50% reduction by 2050. For us, that's 90 million litres a day, approximately, which is around 350,000 people. So a fair chunk, and that's at today's consumption levels. If we can modify behaviour and people become more aware and start to use less, it could help cope for a lot more. So we're investing heavily in our leakage reduction. We've already reduced. Towards that 50%, we've already achieved 18% of that in the last 4 years. And the idea is by 2030, we'll have at least done 2/3 of that reduction in a third of the time. because we are in this southeast area where the supply is so constrained. So the other thing about leakage is it's more certain. It's a more certain delivery of benefit. We know how to fix leaks, we know how to repair them, we know how to lay new mains. So it does come with a more certainty, whereas the behavioural change stuff comes with less certainty. So it's my job at Affinity Water to try and work out how do we get to that 90 million litres per day. And obviously increasing resources levels, we're looking at new technologies of how can we find and fix them faster. But an additional thing for climate change on me is it does actually affect leakage management. So we are seeing a real change in how leakage breaks out across our water supply networks. So I've been in the industry 20 years, and traditionally, you got a cold snap in the winter, it would blow up pipes, it'd freeze and thaw, and you would go and find them and repair them. But certainly in the last 10 years, I've seen a real shift to seeing summer impacts having a more significant impact on leakage breakout. And that's through the ground drying out faster, rapider and deeper, and then with the rapid wetting, so we're getting more ground movement from expansion and constriction. And a lot of the networks that we have out there are made up of rigid material pipes, irons, PVCs, cements. They don't like moving. So, they are going to break more as a result of what we're seeing through climate change. So it does pose a leakage management challenge. How do we compensate for that part of what's happening as well? So we're doing lots of work on how do we find and fix leakage faster to do that. So things like we're using satellite technologies, satellite leakage detection surveys. Again, it allows us to cover wider areas very quickly, and also fibre optic leak detection is a new thing that's coming along. We're working with a number of suppliers on how can we develop use of the existing fibre optic network, which is everywhere and is rolling out across the country, to help us find and fix things sooner. So there's a lot of development happening in the leakage space, and in the last 5 years it has really accelerated, which is fantastic to see. So it's very much a race to stay ahead of the climate change on the impact on leakage, so we can achieve that 90 million litres in our supply area. I'll quickly wrap up, but I would advise, if you're really interested in what David and I have been talking about and the challenges that are out there, please go and read water resources management plans. Every company has to produce one every 5 years. You don't have to read the full hundreds and hundreds of pages. Each company will produce a nice technical, a little summary, maybe 30 or 40 slides, which are easy to digest. But for your water company, for your supply area, please go and read it and see what they're proposing and see what they believe the challenges are and how you can get involved. And if later on, if you want to ask me anything about leakage in detail, please do. Thank you.
There are a number of solutions, but all of them are very complex. We can try to stop the flooding. We can put up barriers, or we can dredge rivers, or we can provide storage areas on floodplains for water. We can try and manage the water that's coming down from upland areas by managing catchments. Or we could try and stop the damage by protecting houses, by retrofitting houses with devices to stop the water running off. We can, alternatively, rather than doing either of those two things, we could try and stop death and mental health issues emanating from flooding, so concentrating on the human side of things. Or we could, again, alternatively, try to pay the costs of flooding, or pay for the flooding, accept the flooding, but pay for the costs through insurance. We could, alternatively again, remove or reduce the things that can be damaged. We could stop developing on floodplains or take material, buildings and so on away from floodplains. And finally, in the very long term, we could perhaps try and reverse climate change, which is, as we heard this morning, generating higher flood peaks or more intense rainstorms alongside longer periods of drought. And again, climate change having particular implications for flooding. Now, I'm going to pass you over to my colleagues here, and just to say again, I'm very grateful for them all being willing to stick their heads above parapets. And we're going to look at the issue of whether or not we are doing enough to respond to the threat of flooding.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much indeed for the invitation to speak here this afternoon. The question we've got is the UK doing enough to respond to the threat of flooding? And I'm going to respond to that primarily in my capacity as a commissioner of the National Infrastructure Commission. For those of you who don't know the NIC, it's government's official advisors on long-term infrastructure, so that spans across energy, transport, water, waste, digital communications, and flooding is part of that. And we have a remit to advise on sustaining economic growth, improving competitiveness, improving quality of life, and enhancing resilience and net zero. And the flooding part of the conversation, which is what we're talking about today, is very much to do with resilience, and in particular resilience to climate change. The NIC is responsible for conducting the National Infrastructure Assessment every 5 years, and the second National Infrastructure Assessment was published in November last year, and it said quite a few things about flooding, which I'm going to refer to. And the Commission also does an annual progress review, which assesses how government is progressing against the recommendations within the National Infrastructure Assessment. And so to answer this question, is the UK doing enough? Actually, the annual progress review is quite a good kind of reference document to explain whether we're doing enough or not. And actually, in just a couple of weeks' time, on the 16th of May, the Commission will publish its 2024 annual progress review. I'm not going to jump the gun in terms of the precise nature of what the Commission statement is going to be in a couple of weeks' time, but I think we can already kind of understand the broad nature of that, insofar as it relates to flooding. And the big picture of that is, whilst we see some positive progress in terms of the way in which flooding is being addressed, government and other bodies are not acting fast enough given the scale of the threat. On the positive side, we have a stable and reasonably long-term funding model. The funding allocation of 5.2 billion for flood risk management was over the period 2021 to 2027. So that's better than the Environment Agency has had before, in that it has a 6-year funding window. But there is a question in terms of what happens after that, and I'll come back to that question in a moment. But having said that, the Commission is not seeing enough progress in terms of actually reducing flood risk. And we're not the only people saying that. The National Audit Office and the Public Accounts Committee have also recently shared similar concerns in terms of the direction of travel, some lack of urgency, some log jams in the system which are impairing progress in terms of the scale of support that can be provided. So if that's the broad picture of where is the UK on this right now, and I should say that the the Commission's recommendations, because of the kind of complex nature of our remit, relate to England in terms of flooding, but I think a lot of what's being said, at least in some senses, is transferable to the other nations of the UK. So if that is the situation, well, what would we recommend in terms of what more should be done? We said in the second National Infrastructure Assessment that by 2025, government should set out measurable targets for flood risk reduction. And for the most part, in populated areas, that should be an annual probability of flooding of 0.5%, and in the most built-up urban areas, 0.1% annual probability, so a 1,000-year return period, if you prefer that kind of language. New housing should be resilient to flooding to this new national standard. The 5.2 billion spending settlement, which we think is roughly of the right order, should be extended and over actually a time frame of the next 30 years, shaped by specific long-term targets to ensure that that funding is used most effectively. The use of nature-based solutions, which I'm sure we're going to talk about, should be maximized and should be fully integrated within the flood risk management arrangements. Investment in maintenance needs more attention. The National Audit Office drew out that point as well, that there was actually a 34 million shortfall in maintenance of flood defences. And I mean, this is crazy, really, that we're not investing relatively small sums of money in order to make sure that the assets that we have are functioning as well as they possibly can. The year before last, the Commission published a report, this was in November 2022, on surface water flooding. So this is flooding usually in urban areas where intense rainfall directly leads to flooding because of lack of capacity in the drainage system. And we analysed that. We found that 325,000 properties in England are in areas at high risk of surface water flooding. And we think that could increase by up to 70%, so to more than 500,000 properties. The growth in the area of impermeable surfaces in urban areas is one of the drivers behind that increasing number. That could add another 20% in increasing risk. And we analysed a package of measures which could get the surface water flood risk down by about 60%. This is a very difficult problem to eliminate altogether. It can be extremely costly to do so. But there are a whole bunch of cost-beneficial things which could be done, costing roughly £12 billion between now and 2050, which could get surface water flooding down by about 60%. Another crucial part of this is not making the problem worse by connecting new developments into the drainage system. There's a piece of legislation, so-called Schedule 3 of the 2010 Flood and Water Management Act. That's a piece of legislation which was enacted 14 years ago, you're not wrong. And Schedule 3, however, has still not been implemented. And one of our recommendations to government was to proceed as rapidly as possible with the implementation of Schedule 3. And one of our main recommendations also was that the kind of complexity with surface water flooding is that funding comes from a variety of different sources. The water companies are responsible for drainage. The Environment Agency gets some grant in aid from government to do surface water flooding projects. Local authorities are supposed to be driving that forwards. What we said is that there needs to be joint plans. We need to identify the hotspots of surface water flood risk and come up with joint time-bound plans for what needs to be done in order to get the risk down, and how much is that going to cost. The government has responded to our report on surface water flooding. There's some good things in the response. They are now taking forward the call to implement Schedule 3. And apparently they're finalising plans to do that by the end of this year. That's welcome, but we really hope that there's no further delay there. Government's going to review the position in terms of impermeable surfaces, but for now there isn't actually any commitment in terms of what should be done about impermeable surfaces. And the government has said it will consider further the merits of the national targets that we've called for. But given that the Committee on Climate Change, the National Audit Office are all in agreement on the need for targets, it's not really clear what further needs to be considered. And the government didn't accept the recommendation in terms of devolved funding and developing joint funding packages to systematically address hotspots of surface water flood risk. So we're disappointed by that. So in short, I'm conscious of time. Sorry, I've gone on a bit here. You can tell I'm quite exercised by it. But in short, the answer to is the UK doing enough to respond to the threat of flooding? I think the answer is not yet.
So sustainable drainage is really just a method of managing water. And the ideal is to manage it on the surface as far as you can, so that it never, in an ideal situation, potentially will leave the site that is being drained. So as you can imagine, if that's the circumstance that you can create, a lot of the problems that we have potentially with surface water flooding would start to disappear. Clearly, in extreme events, then it's likely that there would be surface water runoff, and indeed, for most schemes they are. But what the system will do is to slow the flow. And again, that jargon you may have heard. Slowing the flow is quite a sort of something that everybody's trying to do. And the reason that you want to do that is because when it rains, you get a very high intensity of rain and something that is called peak flow. And then it diminishes very quickly as the rain stops. And so what you're getting, and this is how the flooding occurs, is because of the volumes of water that you're getting during that intensity of the original part of the storm, and that it cannot be held within systems. Whereas with sustainable drainage, because the way it's designed breaks it down into a series of much smaller what we would call components, that what that does is it takes out the peak flow completely. So it rises reasonably quickly, but to a much lower level, and then it probably stays at a very consistent level of water going through a site, and then it will tail off over a very extended period of time. So it has an ability, when we want to do it in terms of retrofitting areas where we know there is existing flooding, we can go in there and retrofit those estates and those houses or those town centres with components which are particularly design systems that will do that interaction of holding that water back and preventing the flooding from happening. The only problem that we have when we're retrofitting is it's a lengthy and expensive system to actually undertake, because in every instance you are literally working on a very defined piece of ground that, as you can imagine, if you were trying to do a whole housing estate, not that everywhere would have flooded, that to actually make the number of interventions necessary to do that is both lengthy and expensive to do. So what do we need to do? Well, the first thing we need to do is to make sure that really new development just does not do that. And that has been one of the problems we've had from the Flood and Water Management Act not being properly implemented, is that we had a system that said, install sustainable drainage unless it can be demonstrated that it's not appropriate. I mean, where does the not appropriate come from? I've never come across a site that it's not appropriate to do it on. And the point is that in those intervening years, the industry has been out there and has invented all of these different ways that you can do it. So there is many ways that you can do it. So the point is, you can do it absolutely everywhere. Now, I teach SUDS design and construction along with my civil engineering colleague, and you know, we can show you how it's been done on, you know, we get told, oh, the slopes are too steep, the slopes are too shallow, it's contaminated land. There is always a way to do this. You just have to understand how to do it, what the issues are, and how to work around them. So we now have a system where we have a policy that's inadequate. We do hope that it will be resolved. You know, I've been sitting on the DEFRA panel, working group that's been looking at this new guidance, and it's going round and round at the moment. It's much later than we thought it was going to be. I think we're all sitting there hoping that ministers or whoever doesn't get their hands on it and change it again, because this was the problem that we had from the legacy of 2010. So think about today. So retrofitting is really important. It is a big tool in helping to deal with towns and cities, all at a very small scale to improve the issues. But also bear in mind that at the bigger scale, things like larger scale catchment management or smaller scale catchment management schemes are doing the same thing in principle, just on a much bigger scale. So we do have the toolbox ready and available to us. We just have to, one, understand it. And from my point of view, if we're going to do these interventions, then we need to do it in a way that is thoroughly integrated into our environment and makes a really positive contribution towards the quality of the environment and the places that people live, because we deserve to do it properly. So I'm keeping it short so we can have discussion. But just to say, all of this is drainage, you know. I think you could say that's not bad for drainage. So let's learn how to do it properly. Let's get the legislation in place, and then let's enforce it. Let's make sure that through the planning system, all the other people who are involved in this exercise of looking at new development and considering is it acceptable, we must have that policy to make sure that it is and get it to contribute to the environment in a positive way.
Thank you, sir.
Carolyn, in her introduction, mentioned the idea that floods are something that's been increasing over time. So if we have a look at how rainfalls, river flows, and flood losses have changed over the last, say, 30 years, what we see is there has been modest increase in heavy rainfall. So those are up, according to the Met Office, around about 10% over the last 30 years. In terms of river flow, there's a more mixed picture with geographical variation. So in northwest Scotland, for example, river flows are up, peak river flows are up about 10% a decade over that period. Southeastern England, it's pretty much flat or small single-digit changes. And then in terms of losses, we can look at data from the Association of British Insurers, and what we see there is practically no trend in the insurance payouts that the insurers make over the last 20 years. And that's just dominated by noise in the system. You know, the flood losses are very variable year on year. You know, and just as a good example, we've had the wettest winter on record. We've certainly not had the biggest flood season on record. So rainfall and flooding are not necessarily the same things. So that's what we know about changes over time. On average, the ABI thinks that we pay out around about £700 million per annum in flood insurance. And that contrasts, as Jim says, to about £1 billion a year we spend on flood defence. So economically, that would look like a rational set of decisions, as Jim says. Slight mismatch, but that's just the direct cost of flooding. It's probably an underestimate in it, and it doesn't account for all the social harms of flooding as well. But nevertheless, if you were an economist in the Treasury, you would look at those and think, okay, well, we've made an economically rational decision there. But how do we think that's going to change into the future? And part of my research at University of Bristol we've recently published a paper looking at that for the UK. So we built a very detailed model of flood risk across the UK, so at 25-metre resolution over the entire of England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. And we've looked at the flooding from 1990, when we had about 0.6 of a degree of global warming, to present day, where we're up at about 1.1 degree of global warming above pre-industrial, and all the way into the future under different climate emission scenarios. The advantage of doing this in a model is you don't just have one set of history, one set of observations to work with. Instead, what we do is we generate many thousands of years of realistic 1990s. So we stochastically sample the climate so we can get very long records, and then we can be much more confident about the results. And what those simulations show is that average annual flood losses between 1990 and present day have changed really very little, a couple of percent. And even if we have a really extreme year, so the worst flooding that we might see in a year for 100 years, then actually national annual losses have only gone up around about 6%, something like that. So that kind of ties in with what the ABI observe and the observational record that we have. But what will happen in the future under different climate emission pathways? And what we see there is that the scenario, the pathway we follow, really matters. So if we meet Paris Agreement targets and we end up in a world of around about 1.8 degrees of warming above pre-industrial, actually the additional increase in UK flood risk is pretty modest under that scenario. So average annual flood losses go up 4%, and one in 100 years, so 0.01 probability years, the losses go up by about 8%. Now, probably that we can deal with that. That is within our ability to manage. However, if we go down an emissions pathway where we get to, say, 2.5 or 2.7 degrees, probably where we're currently going to end up, or even if the climate is more sensitive than we think, and we end up above 3 degrees, then the increase in extreme flood year losses could be as much as 40% and more than 25% for average annual losses. And again, that's going to be a much bigger engineering challenge. So if we come back to the question of are we doing enough to respond to the threat of floods, you could rephrase that question as, are we doing enough to control our carbon emissions as a planet? And I think there, the jury's out. It does not look hopeful given the progress made at the most recent COP summits. The second point about our simulations that I'm going to finish on is that the geography really matters. So all the numbers I've quoted are national totals. And actually, even if we look in a world where temperature rises of pre-industrial are only 1.8 degrees, and we only have 4% increase in average annual flood losses for the UK, actually, if we look at the geography of those losses, there are winners and losers. So even under that very conservative scenario, we see some places with more than 25% increases in average annual losses, and some places where they're flat or may even go down. So there's a whole swathe from southwest through the Midlands to northeast England, northeast Scotland, where increases in flood losses in that scenario are pretty flat. And other areas, southeast England, southwest Wales, northwest England, where we see much greater increases. So geography matters. I'm a geographer, I would say that, of course, but it happens to be true. And we've done all these projections with the latest Met Office climate projections. If you use different climate projections, you would get different absolute numbers, but I think you would see the same broad patterns, that climate trajectory is incredibly important, and geography matters. So the spatial variability and risk increases are going to be quite considerable into the future. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Pleased to say that in this section we're going to be looking at Britain's water pollution and attempting to grapple with the question of who is responsible. Now, I'm very grateful for the people who've come along, and I said this earlier, for people who are prepared to stick their heads above the parapet. I'll introduce them briefly and then just say a little bit about the challenge. So today we have with us Professor Peter Hammond, who is a retired Professor of Computational Biology at University College London. And importantly now, in terms of what he does, he is a founder member, I think, of Windrush Against Sewage Pollution. That's the River Windrush, not the ship. Richard Bramley, on the left there, is a farmer. He has a farm, a 500 and something acre farm near York, just south of York. And importantly for us, he is the National Farmers Union Environment Forum chair, and again a frequent speaker at conferences on behalf of the farming community. Now, challenges that we face in terms of water quality. Again, just like the other two sessions today, it's quite difficult to know where to start. We only have an opportunity really to discuss two types of perspectives here, but there are clearly lots of challenges with the quality of the water in our rivers and on beaches particularly. In the published statistics for England suggest that there were 460,000 spills of semi-raw sewage into our rivers last year, totaling something like over 4 million hours of discharges. So that's basically raw sewage overflowing into rivers and beaches from, I think, 14,000 storm overflows. And that figure is half as much again as it was in 2022, largely as a result of wet weather. Now, that's only one kind of challenge. Clearly, there are lots of origins of pollution in rivers, from industry, from agriculture, from domestic premises, and indeed road drainage as well. And we can't talk about all of them today. But regulators, the Environment Agency and Ofwat, and indeed citizen science groups increasingly are suggesting that this pollution is very widespread, it's very damaging to aquatic wildlife and plants, and potentially to human health. Some of you will have seen the discussion about the boat race in the Thames a couple of weeks ago. Usually, or frequently, we can tell. We see unsightly debris in rivers and on beaches, yet the water companies say they're not acting illegally, and attempts to reduce agricultural runoff seem largely unsuccessful for a variety of reasons, which I'm sure Richard will talk about. And I absolutely want to emphasise that Richard is doing his best in terms of his own farming practices to be very highly responsible, actually. So how can we sort this out? That's, I think, the big question, but also who is responsible?
So I was preparing a few notes for today, and it occurred to me when I looked at the other speakers that they're all still active, working in the water or in the environment or whatever. And I've been retired 10 years, and I have never done anything to do with water and the environment. So the obvious question is, why the hell am I here? So
you just happened to be passing, Peter. That's what it was. I sort of hooked you in off the street.
So the reason is, and Carolyn has hinted at it, and I should have thanked her to begin with for inviting me here. I actually live on a river, the River Windrush in West Oxfordshire. In fact, the river goes underneath the building that I live in because it's a converted mill, which I partly own. I share a garden with two other houses. The garden is enormous and it's surrounded by the river. I've lived there 20 years, and over that 20 years, I observed the river deteriorate. And by about, 2014 or so, I was starting to get really worried. And then we had a new neighbour, my colleague Ash Smith, who founded Windrush Against Sewage Pollution, and he said, we've got to do something about this. So we started to look into the reasons why the river was deteriorating and who was to blame. Now, like many people, we first of all started, let's look in the river. Let's start testing what's in it. Let's look at phosphate and et cetera, et cetera. But, as an academic, and especially as a mathematician, I thought, hang on, unless you do this scientifically, unless you know exactly where to test regularly at the same places in the same ways, and do it over a long period of time, over many seasons, you're really not going to produce anything. So I switched my attention to the water industry And so I started to look at what's going in the river from sewage treatment works. Now, the WASP group was founded in 2018. We'd already started talking about it and thinking about it, talking to the Environment Agency, talking to Thames Water, which is our local water company. And so I started then using what are called environmental information regulation legislation to do freedom of information type requests, to get data from the water companies. And over the next 6 years, until now, I've been analyzing that data, and this is the result. 700 pages of documented analysis that, in particular, establishes where the water companies have been breaking the law. They've been discharging untreated sewage into many rivers, and it isn't just the Windrush, by the way. 700 pages on the Windrush would be crazy. Eventually I started to spread my wings, and as news got out that we were doing this kind of thing, people started to approach me. And so I've inevitably gone into something like 1,000 sewage works across the country, across tens of rivers. So it's not just specifically to the Windrush. So what we found, for example, is that on at least 5,000 days in the last 6 or 7 years, water companies have been breaching these permit restrictions that say when they can discharge untreated sewage. And that's what the emphasis has been on, as you've seen in the news, the spills. But actually, we also looked at treated sewage and actually have uncovered examples where the water companies breached their permits for that as well. And remember, that's going out 7/24, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. So the animal life, which is what my particular interest is being exposed to this chronically. Okay, so now what have I learned, and what am I going to focus on then for these brief few minutes? Now, we could talk about the finance. You've seen a lot of that in the press in recent times. Thames Water about to go under. Should they be nationalized? Should they go into special administration? We could talk about the issues of planning. What do we do when we know that a river's being damaged by a sewage work that's being mismanaged, when we're about to build another 150 houses and all that sewage is going to go and strain the system even more? But I think I'll put that aside maybe for the discussion. There are 3 things I want to talk about, particularly one where I think the blame lies, and that's regulation. The second one, the 2 other issues that I'm kind of becoming concerned about, and that is regional differences, whether it's water companies or regulators across sort of country boundaries. And the third one is health and environmental damage, and things that we are not thinking about, and I think are kind of bite us in the bum in 10 years' time or further on, probably before. I mean, I won't be alive when it happens, I suspect, but we'll see. So what about regulation? So the Environment Agency, according to the data I've collected and analysed, have been very weak in managing the water companies. And one of the things, 2 of the weaknesses are, first of all, they've been not clear about what the water companies should be doing. The rules of operation have not been clear, and also they've not been applied to the letter. Often the regulators will sort of back off and say, well, let's work with the company to try and make the sewage works legal. Let's not hit them hard and make them do it. Some of you may have seen, I uncovered Cardigan Sewage Works was discharging untreated sewage for 10 years, illegally. Every spill was illegal for 10 years. And Natural Resources Wales, the Welsh equivalent of the EA, just kept saying to them, well, can we fix this? Let's get together and fix it. And they never did. And now they're going to spend a lot of money and they're going to build a new sewage works after being exposed to the sort of public scrutiny. Now, if you're going to regulate properly, you need good data. Now, the agency has never routinely asked for the right data from the water companies. I've always asked for the detailed information about what they're doing. The agency asks for summary data, and you can't really regulate on that basis. But I don't think things are going to improve quickly with the Environment Agency. I've met the new head of the Environment Agency, and I'm impressed by him, Philip Duffy. I think things will improve. But before that can happen, I think we'll still need people like me looking into what's going on. So we'll need public access to data. Now, some of you may have noticed that Thames Water, around about this time last year, produced a sewage map online. And they did it at a time when the sewage season was at its sewage spilling was at its highest. And their map was just covered in red spots where all these sewage works were discharging untreated sewage. As of yesterday, 6 more water companies announced their sewage maps. So now there are 7 companies that you can go and look at their website and see when they're spilling in near real time. So within hours of them starting to spill. So there's an improvement. The other thing we need to do, sorry, I've got a post-COVID cough and I can feel it coming on. I don't want to start coughing like crazy. We need to give the agency more funding. They also need to choose the right metrics. There's been a focus on spill frequency, but I've been able to unravel and show that water companies cheat. If they've got a water sewage works that's about to spill, they'll use tankers to take that sewage to another one that is spilling, so instead of 2 spills, you get 1. So the total counter spills goes down, and they look better. The other question is trustworthy data. In 2009, something called operator self-monitoring was introduced, where water companies test their own treated sewage, report it to DEFRA and the agency, and there's little checking on what's going on, and we've shown that they cheat that as well. Only half of all treated sewage is ever tested for quality between the hours of 7 and 3. The rest of the day, it's never tested. And so what you can show is that actually in the middle of the day when they test, the values are low, like, for instance, permitted ammonia, but in the evening, they go up and they breach their permit. And there are many examples of that. I mentioned regional differences. What's worrying me about that is that every water company is a monopoly in its own area. You can't change a water company, and they behave differently. For example, I talked about data access and openness. Only 3 of the 10 water companies in Wales and England will give me data now, because the Environment Agency announced 2 years ago a detailed investigation of water companies, and so these 7 water companies say, it will prejudice our day in court, therefore we're not going to give you the data. Now that's about to change because of the landmark case announced just this week, which is actually I'll explain perhaps a bit more detail later, has forced water companies to do that. Excuse me. The other regional difference is there are differences between the regulators. Natural Resources Wales have got a 21st century public information system. You can go on there and instantly download information. That's very interesting and useful. The EA, you send an email, you wait a month, and you get the data if you're lucky, or the answer. SEPA in Scotland, they had a cyber attack 3 years ago. They've not recovered from it yet, so you can't actually get to their public data. Finally, health. The 2 things that really concern me, microplastics, antimicrobial resistance. They're intimately connected, which I'll explain further, perhaps in the questions. I think we're at the stage where like the tobacco industry was when it was denying the link between smoking and lung cancer. So you've got Severn Trent Water's CEO, Liv Garfield, when she was interviewed by the House of Commons Environmental Audit Committee asking about spills, she said, it's just water. What's the problem? So it's being denied by the water industry. But if you want to know more, I think you can ask me in the question time.
Okay.
Thank you.
I was chomping at the bit in the last session as well as the farmer in the room. We're talking about flooding because a third of my farm acts as floodwater storage south of York. And it's a farm that's been farmed for centuries. The house is over 200 years old, and all the maps point to all that activity. It's becoming unfarmable. Interesting that the data that was being put forward on insurable claims, none of my losses are insurable. That floodwater storage is protecting those homes that are not needing to make those claims. And I think that we need to look at it very differently. And it was touched on in the last session as well, before I get on to the important subject of water quality, about the unbelievably wet period that we've been through, and the impact on farms. Quite simply, if we were living in 1597, we'd be facing famine this year. The disconnect between agriculture and the general population and what goes on is quite staggering. We're lucky that we've got the ability to import, and I've been at Innovation Zero yesterday and this morning. That's focusing on the impact of climate change on our food system. And this morning, in the very first session, it was made, the first point that was made was food security is national security, is global security. That need to make sure that we've got resilience in our agricultural systems is going to be paramount. And it's connected to water quality, undoubtedly. So I am a proper farmer. I'm not a technical expert in these things. If I wasn't here, I'd be planting potatoes. I've got the hands to show it. That's what I do most of the time. But I'm also active within the NFU, and it's something that I've been particularly I picked up on very early without really realising it, that connection between the environment and food production. That twin goal that we're trying to do both on farms. It's for everybody's benefit. I've got this role in the environment as chair of the Environment Forum. And water quality is one of the big topics. The other one, and it's an important topic, the other one, which I consider a bit of a sideshow, is the subject of beavers, which you mentioned as well earlier as well.
Well, they're so cute, aren't they? I mean,
and this is the problem, but it's not all black and white. Okay, so water pollution takes many guises, and let's be clear, it's essentially down to human activity. And one of those is agriculture, and it's an important one. Now, essentially in agriculture, we've got three main strands. We've got the plant protection products that the majority of our food is produced using. We've got nutrients, namely the nitrates and the phosphates. And we've got the soil itself, the sediment. Now, all of these constituents are valuable to the farmer on the farm, not in the watercourse. So there's been a lot of initiatives over the years that have been looking to try and reduce this happening because it's in everybody's interests. So hence, as a few examples, we've seen the creation of the voluntary initiative in 2001, which has resulted in now 2 million hectares of cropped land being covered by ICMs, which is Integrated Crop Management Plan. Means that farmers have sat together with their agronomist, their advisor, and they've looked at how they can reduce using pesticides, how they can best use them to get the best impact on the crop with the least impact on the environment. Then 20,000 registered and trained operators who have to go through continuous professional development in order to maintain the ability to use those products. And 16,000 crop sprayers are now annually tested, and none of that is something that existed before the creation of that scheme. On nutrient use, we've seen large drops in both nitrogen, phosphate and organic manures. And farmers have now got access, and have done for a number of years, to tools like Tried and Tested, which helps hone their use of those organic manures. And there's a widespread adoption of soil testing and nutrient management plans. There's a big focus on soil health. You won't all be reading the Farmers Weekly every week, but I am, and so are a lot of other farmers, and soil health is something that's been Top of the agenda, I would say, for at least 5 years. You can't open an edition without seeing that. And then we've had an awful lot of technological advances to support this. So 2 years ago, I invested with the help of a government grant in a scanner that sits on the top of my tractor, and it monitors the crop as it's going through, and it feeds it accordingly with what it, we put in various parameters, and it feeds it what it needs. So there's avoidance of overdosing. Then we had the Campaign for the Farmed Environment, another example, which was launched in 2009, along with government stewardship schemes, means now that most watercourses have protective buffer zones. However, as water testing goes to show, there's still a huge amount to do and some tough targets under the Environment Act. I'll just repeat, it doesn't make sense for those products, those nutrients, that soil, to end up in the watercourse. Though it may not be possible for us to ever eliminate it, we can continue the path to improve. And on that point, I'll pick up on your opening bit where you used the phrase, whilst attempts to reduce agricultural runoff seem largely unsuccessful. So I'm going to suggest that we have had some success. Firstly, there's those significant reductions in nitrogen use of 42% and phosphorus of 69% since the 1980s. And a 26% reduction in the amount of manures, organic manures used. Now, there's an irony there because there's an active policy going on to encourage us to use more organic manures on farms. It's a central element of recycling those nutrients. Rather than using manufactured nitrogen, rather than mining phosphorus from Moroccan hillsides, we need to be recycling that. And the use of those organic manures, including our own, is going to be critical to that. So couple that with significant improvements in nutrient efficiency, the tools, the understanding of the farming community, technology, widespread adoption of cover cropping, then you have to ask yourself, if we're not making some inroads, what should we do? Cease farming? That clearly isn't going to be possible. Another example is from 2006 to 2018, catchment-sensitive farming has reduced, these will be their figures, agricultural pollutant losses by 4 to 12%, and that's through providing farmers with advice and access to grants. But it must be noted it's not available in all areas. I don't fall in one of those areas. And according to modelling, these reductions have brought about 1 to 6% improvement in water quality across targeted catchments, and monitoring shows a 5 to 22% reduction in monitored nutrient, sediment and fecal indicator organism concentrations. Also, monitoring has shown a 34% reduction in monitored pesticide concentrations, exceeding 0.1 microgram in the same catchments over the same time. Just two examples of some progress in that. We'll probably discuss later whether that's happened fast enough and whether and how quickly we need to go on the rest. But what I will say is in recent years we've also had measures like the new regulation under the farming rules for water. Again, that's something we might discuss in some detail because it's an interesting one. Tenfold rise in enforcement visits. Although these need to be sensitively managed on farms, a lot of farms are often small family units, and an advisory approach is probably going to get more benefits in the long run, I think, working with farms to help them identify weaknesses and improve on them. We've got the ELMS scheme, the environmental land management, the 3 tiers there, which is only just beginning to get hold. Slurry investment grants, there's been 2 tranches of that. Barely touches the surface of the investment that's needed after decades of underinvestment due to low returns on farms. And other grants that are available. Cluster group activity, there's farmers who are getting together and they're starting to measure their own water quality. That's going to be good because that'll be a real incentive that they'll see from their work, and nutrient neutrality, which is, again, a new thing. And we met with Alan Lovell in February, who'll be colleague of Paul Duffy's, Philip Duffy's. And he put the challenge forward that water quality is an issue that he wants to see us look to address, and it's something we are very keen to work with others to address. So I'll leave it there, and we'll see what pops up in the discussions.
Okay,
right?
thank you very much. Lady in the green jacket.
Thank you. That was all really interesting. I'm a lawyer with Mission Purpose, and I'd be particularly interested in your thoughts on legal action and what role it can play. I heard your comments on working with, but obviously the regulatory deficit as well. I'm very aware of your work with LEAD. And where do you think is the biggest potential to perhaps push things towards more accountability?
Do you want to just say, before you hand the microphone back, do you want to just clarify what you mean by the regulatory deficit?
Well, just what Professor Hammond seemed to be alluding to, that there seem to be issues with the regulation. And do you think perhaps legal action is a way to address that?
Well, the action that we're both involved in, which is involving 6 water companies, that's not so much about the regulator, it's about the water companies, but it shows a weakness of the regulator. So basically, because the water companies, in addition to having operator self-monitoring, they have what's called self-reporting. So they're supposed to report when they spill untreated sewage. But if they underplay that, it looks like they've reached the targets they've agreed with Ofwat. And so then when they negotiate costings, price increases, customer charges, they actually may be allowed to increase their prices when actually they should be paying money back to their customers because they performed far worse than they've claimed. So that's more the water company, but it's associated with the regulator not realising they haven't got a firm grip on it.
I'd like to intervene, though, from the point of perhaps playing devil's advocate. It's going to cost a lot, and we seem, as a society, unwilling to pay it, the cost of sorting this out. Now, estimated costs have been in the press. This is just for the water companies, and I know Richard will have, has commented previously on how much it's going to cost for the farmers to respond. But the costs that are reported in the press for water companies range up to something like £56 billion. Now, what government is going to agree to that?
No, I agree it is going to be expensive, but, and I'm not an expert on the finances, and so I tend to read stuff by people like Dieter Helm, Professor Dieter Helm. You'll find he's got some very good ideas about what's happening. He says, for instance, that what customers pay to the water companies is enough to keep the water companies ticking over. What we pay is actually enough to for them to do their job properly. The question is the investment needed to actually, repair the damage that they've allowed to happen? And I agree, that's really going to be very difficult. After all, the water companies have given £72 billion in 30 years to their shareholders. Thames Water, since privatisation, its shareholders have never paid in more than they've taken out. So I agree it's going to be expensive and difficult, but it really aggravates me, it annoys me significantly that the water companies are going to get away with this perhaps eventually. Thames Water, may go under, and that might be a test case. That might be an example that we can use then, because if it goes into special administration and is successful, those other water companies are going to be very, very worried about, maybe we're going to move towards something more like that model for the future, where instead of the money that we pay going to shareholders, it's actually going in to invest in infrastructure and improve things.
Richard, can I put the similar question to you? I won't put it in quite the same way, but obviously you quoted the DEFRA figure of, what was it, £74 million in slurry infrastructure. I mean, that actually seems like peanuts to solve the problem. I mean, have you got any sense of what it might cost to sort things out?
The back of the envelope that I did with the guy that I mentioned earlier, we thought it'd been more like 2 billion. But hindsight's a wonderful thing. It would have been great if dairy farmers had been able to...
So that's just on dairy farmers, the 2 billion?
That was, yeah. But again, I'm no finance expert, not sat down and, actually done a proper exercise. It's definitely it was a rough sort of like thought. And we did that to try and get a feel for how many years it would take using that current scheme, which was initially 17 million. It was massively oversubscribed and the government doubled it to 35 million, the first tranche, and then they've repeated it with the second tranche. I don't know how targeted it is on whether it's in the worst catchments, for example. But that would be a place to start. But it, as you're saying, it's fairly widespread, the issue. So at that pace, it's going to take an awful lot of years.
Sorry, can I just say, I mean, on top of that, of course, there's all the issues about drainage from our roads, isn't there? So we've got rubber particulates off car tyres, we've got the legacy of lead still kicking around, we've got a lot of sediment and oils.
There's something like 200 or so different water pollutants. In agriculture, in some ways, the pesticides are the complex one. But the nutrients and the soil, they're relatively simple.
Well, you mean in the sense that it's in the farmer's interests to do it? Yes. Okay.
But there are some highly toxic chemicals out there which we've used historically, some of which, I can't remember the names of them, are almost unable to be removed.
Right.
And our water courses, if they fail on one thing, they fail on the lot. And that's why we're keen that in time farmers get the opportunity where they can to undertake their own water testing so that the parameters that they're impacting, they can get an understanding of how they're seeing improvements.
Well, don't they get the opportunity? They could test the water themselves now, couldn't they? Just have to buy an off-the-shelf Palin test kit and do it.
There are a number of cluster groups who are just... I haven't seen any results yet. I think they're wanting to get a feel for how it's going before they start to publish any results. But incentivizing people by making them feel good about what they've achieved is, I don't underestimate that aspect of human nature. If you're constantly told you're doing a bad thing and you don't feel like, despite undertaking a lot of changes, you're ever getting anywhere, then it's harder to motivate.
Okay.
I'm interested in any international comparisons. Do people in Europe have the same problems as we do, or have they invested and are they in a better place?
I'm just thinking about Australia. It comes immediately to mind. They have found themselves into a similar situation to us, in a sense, only magnified. They had a very long drought. Their resources became very depleted. They then went and invested very heavily in developing new desalination plants to overcome their supply deficiency. Drought ended, reservoirs filled, and not using desalination plants. So it's tricky. It's tricky.
Yeah, but the geography isn't the same. That's why I said
in Europe. In Europe. Yes, I know less about. I know about our water consumption is roughly the same, a personal water consumption, but I know less about their water resource systems. Do you know at all?
No, I know obviously about the leakage management practices.
How do we do leakage-wise as a comparison?
I must about there are some countries which are ahead of us in Europe. There are some geographical issues with that, and age of networks is an issue. Yeah. There are parts of Europe which have a lot younger networks. As networks do age, they do deteriorate. So it does put us beyond those.
I think, though, I agree with you. I think there's quite a lot of variability within Europe on leakage, as you were asking, and on consumption as well, and huge differences seasonally in Mediterranean countries, for example. But certainly on leakage, we are doing less well than a number of other companies, despite the fact that they might appear to have more intractable physical problems. The Netherlands, for example, where they've got lots of heaving soils and so on.
Yeah.
And is it not true that in this country, the rates of leakage have not really altered very much in the last decade or so?
No, they very much plateaued. There was significant reductions made in the late 1990s with the introduction of targets for companies and through the early 2000s, and then the level started to plateau out. So we were targeted on leakage to an economic level of leakage.
And what
seemed
does
to have
that mean
plateaued.
exactly?
Basically,
Who decides?
At what point does it cost £1 more to find it and fix than it does to leak it? Because bills need to be considered. So that, and it moved to the sustainable economic level of leakage after economic to include externalities, and that has caused the plateau. But those have been removed now. We're very much on there's a mandated reduction that we have to achieve.
Which is?
Companies sign up to. So I thought at the last price review back in 2015, 2020, sorry, PR19, said that each company must do a minimum of 15% unless you can show that it's different for your water resources.
Reduce
position.
leakage by
15% as a
per
minimum,
year? Or
across the 5-year period, the 5-year investment cycle.
so it's going to take a long time to get to very low level of leakage then, isn't it? At 15%.
Well, I say the industry is committed to 50% by 2050.
Right. You said that insurable losses from flooding are not really increasing very much over the last few years. I'm very interested in what's not insurable, because back in 2007, when there was the very serious flooding in the Severn in and around Tewkesbury, Cheltenham, Gloucester and so on, further upstream as well, I was the technical advisor to Gloucestershire County Council after the event. And it became apparent that the non-insurable losses were actually probably much higher than the insurable losses. So businesses who were not flooded but couldn't operate for one reason or another may or may not have been insured against that. So, for example, you stop having sanitation, your toilet stops working. You can't run a business on that basis of any sort, actually. There were mental health issues that came out of that, which were huge. Now, I don't know whether, I mean, it seems to be suggested in the press from government in the last few weeks that we're all getting very soft somehow and, not able to cope with mental health problems effectively. But it seems to me that actually mental health is a big issue and is perhaps increasing in terms of flooding. It is I know from that event in 2007 how very serious that can be. So do you think total losses are actually increasing or not?
I mean, I think the ABI data probably correlates reasonably well with those other harms, and it's a good quantitative source of information. I think what we see with the ABI data is that there's no trend over time. The year-to-year variability is really large. So we have years like 2007, where we had 55,000 homes flooded across the UK during June and July. And follow that up by 2008, 2009, where the numbers were, national annual totals were a few thousand. So the year-to-year variability is huge. We had big flood years in 2000, 2007, 2012, 15, 16, and 14 as well, and a few more recently. But it's really variable. But you're absolutely right that being flooded is a terrible experience. You're probably out of your house for 9 to 12 months. The stress of that is huge. It's a deeply unpleasant experience. Lots of your possessions will have been destroyed. The place where you live, call home, will have been trashed. Because flood water is not clean by any stretch of the imagination. And we don't have a good way of accounting for all those harms, but they probably to some extent correlate with the insured direct losses, I think. Or at least that's our best working.
So multiple?
Yeah, absolutely.
So perhaps flat's not necessarily rising then, is that what you're suggesting?
I'm saying that the total losses, so direct and indirect, there's probably no trend in those, and probably the indirect losses correlate with the direct losses, which we can measure. So I think the ABI data is an underestimate of the total harms of flooding, but it's the best quantitative indicator we've got, and it doesn't show a trend.
Okay, thank you. Of course, that's not the way it's being reported in the press, is it? There's a constant procession of storms coming across, and every time we have screaming about more and more flooding, which what you're suggesting is it's not actually the case. But so why do we think there's more flooding?
So scientists are quite conservative people. We'll only look back and identify a trend in 20 or 30 years when we've got enough data to do that. So, one thing, it might be, we might be really seeing the start of a trend, or we might be seeing weather.
I'm an ex-chairman of a planning committee, and I don't know whether this is a reuse or recycling, but why is it that we let so much water simply run away? Why don't, I think we ought to ensure that when rain falls on our roofs, it goes into the gardens, not into the drains. And indeed, we ought to stop, I think, people covering over their gardens to park on. I mean, you can design it so it can take water through. I won't say stop parking, but why is it that we let water just be wasted like that?
Thank you. That's an interesting question. I remember reading some years ago about the government approach in Malta. And what they said there was, which is an interesting one, not a drop will reach the sea. Now, I have issues with that, because we do need, as David said, I think, we do need water in our rivers. And that water's got to come from somewhere. We can't have dry rivers, and in James's area we've got wonderful chalk streams and levels of biodiversity that need enhancing. So
it's like if you go into the ground, it goes into the groundwater, will eventually appear in the rivers anyhow.
Some of it.
Eventually.
Some of it, eventually. Yes, you're right. So anyway, can I invite you to respond?
I've done quite a lot of work actually on rainwater harvesting. So I'm very much a fan of it, a proponent of it. I think it's an excellent idea, and I think to get anywhere near our targets of 110 litres per head per day, we will need it much more widely spread than it is currently. One of the problems that has been with rainwater harvesting is it's a simple system, as you know, typically rain off the roof, down a gutter, down pipe, into some sort of tank underground probably, and then pump it back, maybe into another header tank, and then down to your toilet. The thing is, that requires energy for the pump. And for too long, it was a negative thing. So you save water, but you use extra energy to do that. Modern systems, I call them modern systems, have just about got the pumping optimized enough so that they're kind of net zero in terms of energy. But what we've worked on with a couple of different schemes with entrepreneurs actually who have great ideas, one of them was to capture the rainfall not at the top, not on the whole roof, but halfway down. It seems very simple. Either put an external gutter halfway down your roof, or indeed some sort of tiles and have an internal gutter, and then you could gravitate the water just into the tank and then down to your toilet. Zero energy use. Zero energy use. So there really is no reason why that can't happen now. And you know, some companies will now build that into houses, to new houses, and there's a retrofit option as well. So why aren't we doing that? That's still your question, isn't it? And I don't know the answer to that, because we can do it. We can do it.
Thank you. Jessica Shankelman. I wanted to ask Peter about the sewage treatment works, because obviously the Environment Agency is doing this huge criminal investigation into sewage treatment works specifically, as opposed to the CSOs. And you mentioned about...
So CSOs is combined sewer overflows.
Yeah, so I'm quite interested in that at the moment generally. And I was really interested in you mentioning that the sewage treatment works were trucking sewage to another treatment works to reduce the number. I might be wrong here. I understood that the regulators were looking to change the way they measured the overflow from something called pass flow forward, which is kind of like the amount to have a limit of 10 spills per year. It sounds like you don't think that change would make much difference if they're already kind of trying to get around the number. Is that a fair assumption?
So the goal in the Environment Act is that the average number of spills per year is 10 by 2050. And as I said, we know I have a colleague, Jeff Toombs, who follows the tankers around and gets to chat with the drivers. He's an elderly man, a little cap, and he says, "Oh, you've been working hard today." "Oh yeah, I've been here and I've been taking it there," and that's how we established that that's what they're doing. They also do it with pumping stations that can't cope, and so it happens right near us. They take the sewage out of the pumping station, they take it to a sewage works, because otherwise the pumping station would be flooding onto the road or into the environment. So they manipulate that number. Thames Water had a very interesting way of doing it last year. They found 300 extra overflows. So when they reported their data for 2022, the number of overflows went up, so the total number of spills and the average went down. So there's an interesting way of actually manipulating the data. I actually think they should measure volume, and then you would catch that movement out because you'd be measuring the volume at the pumping station and at the sewage works, so you'd know what was going out, what was being spilled. So you should be measuring. What you mentioned, flow-to-floor treatment. Besides not spilling during dry days, when they spill sewage at the sewage works, they should keep maintaining their treatment process at the capacity of the works. So until the works is straining itself, they shouldn't be spilling. But once that happens, they're allowed to spill. And that's a condition in the permit. But unfortunately, the agency made another big mistake, and they forgot to say, oh, and by the way, put a meter there and measure it. So what did the water companies do? They didn't measure what's going to be treated. They measured what's coming out treated. And one senior director for Thames Water said to me, we might be breaching that permit condition, but you can't prove it because we don't measure. We only measure what's coming out rather than what's being sent to treatment. And only in the last few years have the water companies been forced by the agency to fit these meters. They've got till the end of next year to do that. And that's what's going to show those who are spilling illegally.
I'm interested in the problem of ground saturation, agricultural ground. I recently took the train from Reading down to Bristol, and either side of the line for mile after mile after mile, the land is underwater. Now this is having knock-on effect on crop yields, it's having knock-on effect on product prices. Is there anything that can be done in periods of high rainfall to alleviate the problem of saturated ground not allowing drainage?
Jim?
I mean, this has been all over the news this year because, as we've heard, this is the wettest winter on record. Protection of agricultural areas we've talked about the rationale by which one decides what to do and what not to do in relation to flooding, and agriculture hasn't really featured in terms of the priorities for protection because the scale of what would need to be done is very large, and in many senses we should be looking at ways in which agriculture can adapt to changing weather conditions. Of course, you get a winter like this one, this is a severe loss to many farmers, but farming is a variable business, and some years one has losses and some years one has bumper crops. So I think the way in which we should think about this is how we recognizing that there will be more variability in agricultural production. How do we, to some extent, protect farmers from that and ensure security of food supplies, recognizing that also crop-producing places around the world are subject to much greater variability as well. So I think we need to think about it more in terms of the security of our food system, rather than necessarily thinking about how we prevent flooding in particular pieces of agricultural land.
It's a very emotive subject, though, isn't it? I mean, you know, as the lady at the front said, you look out of the window of your train as you thunder up and down to London, or creep in my case, and you see the ground is saturated, and you hear on the radio farmers talking about it. A cost-benefit analysis will always favour those intensively developed areas which have higher value. As you said, central London will be protected, whereas the Somerset levels, even if we accept that they ought to be protected, won't be, probably, simply because central London land is more valuable. And the same thing actually plays out in relation to housing, doesn't it? Because there would, in cost-benefit analysis, it would make more sense to save higher value homes rather than lower value homes. And that's a very uncomfortable fact, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, let me come back to that point. First of all, in relation to flooding of agricultural land, clearly we're talking about a very significant losses to farmers, and one might say that farmers are not bad at getting their voices heard in the media and so on. But these are serious losses, not to be underestimated, but they do need to be considered in the overall picture of the types of losses that we incur. And as Paul has said, in severe flooding years, one can have hundreds of millions, if not billions, of pounds of losses, and that's the sort of thing we really need to be waking up to. I think it's also kind of worth noting that flooding of agricultural land in floodplains is a natural process, and in many instances those flooded areas are providing flood storage for those flood waters, which means that the waters are not, or maybe less of it, is ending up in urban areas where people are also going to be harmed in very serious ways. So certainly we shouldn't let the agricultural argument drive us towards not using land appropriately for flood storage, because we should be using it for that. The expensive houses versus not so expensive houses, and maybe houses for people which are being rented, argument is a really important one. And in the way in which these decisions are appraised, there is attention paid to that equity question, and we should, in principle, be thinking about households in equal ways, irrespective of whether they live in multi-million-pound mansions or less prosperous dwellings. So that we should not be just using the value of houses as being the calculus here when we're looking at this kind of trade-off. We should be looking at people's homes.
So you spoke quite a bit about water challenges, and it was quite interesting to get your perspective on that. I just wanted to ask a question. In terms of regulations, do you think regulators are doing enough to ensure these policies, or kind of like ensure that water companies are doing enough to protect our water bodies like rivers and things like that? And also, in terms of health concerns, I mean, you mentioned that this is being denied by the water industry. Do you think regulators should be doing more to ensure that water companies are protecting our water bodies from like health issues or things like that? So
two questions then. One is about whether the water companies are doing enough, and then secondly, specifically about health.
I think it was regulators you were asking.
I beg your pardon. Regulators regulating the water sector generally. Peter, do you want to have a go at that?
Well, the evidence I've collected is that the regulators are not doing enough. They've not been firm enough. They've not been clear enough. An example, you've heard people say, sewage only spills in heavy rainfall. Now, actually, if you look at the permit that the water company gets for each sewage work, it just says rainfall. It doesn't say how heavy. So the water companies have been able to drive a coaching horses through that. You know, nobody really knows what that means. So you need clarity, and then you need, as I say, persistence and dogged determination to apply the rules to actually make sure the water companies do what they should do. Another issue where I'd mentioned operator self-monitoring, where the water companies test their own. They're basically doing their own, marking their own homework. You know, they produce the treated effluent and then they test it themselves, give the results to the agency. But the agency doesn't inspect that information. They don't go around to the sewage works and say, well, can we see, you know, exactly what you're doing when you're doing the testing? And I think this needs to be taken away from the water companies. Now, there's a tension between DEFRA, Ofwat, the Environment Agency. So DEFRA believes that they should take it away from the water companies and it should be done independently. Okay? I've spoken recently to the EA and Ofwat, and they believe it should stay with the water companies. Now, I don't know who's going to win that battle, but that's, you know, someone's got to decide on that. I think it should be taken away from the water companies and given to an independent body so that we all can trust the information that's being given to us about, you know, the quality of their treatment process.
Can you just comment briefly on the health issue that the lady raised?
What was it again?
So basically, I asked if regulators should be doing more in terms of...
Well, for example, the sewage effluent is not tested for biological properties like E. coli. You know, they test for phosphate, nitrate, biological oxygen demand, but not E. coli. Now, there's some really interesting work by Professor David Werner up in Newcastle University, where he actually even estimated the risk of inhaling E. coli by children splashing about in a river that's got 19 overflows going into it. That's the River Ousburn in Newcastle. So we should be considering that anywhere where people interact with water, you should give it bathing quality status, and therefore that then lifts it up to a level where there's got to be much more monitoring about the condition of the water.
Because at the moment, there are only a very limited number of designated bathing areas, aren't there?
There are obviously around the coast, but in terms of internal rivers, there are only two sites.
Yeah.
There's the River Wharfe, and there's a bit of the Thames near Oxford, Wolvercote.
I've got a few questions coming through online now. James, a simple one for you. It may not be a simple one. I don't know. It says that the question is from Tessa, and she's saying, for surface leaks, I think she means from pipelines, do you have a leaks hotline that the public could quickly and easily ring if they see water pouring down the street?
Yeah, you can ring into us. We do have an online reporting tool as well.
Okay.
You know, we are looking at other things like apps that people can have on their phone to be able to do that as well.
And there's a second question from the same person. It says, have you considered giving free or cheap water butts to customers to encourage water saving? She says, I believe this has happened recently on the Isle of Wight.
I know it's happened in other companies in the past. I've worked in other companies where it's happened. So I'm not in control of that within Affinity Water, but it has been talked about. What else can we do to help people be water efficient? So we're always looking at what advice we can give, what products we can supply, etc.
But if we come back to that balance between managing the demand by exhorting people to do more themselves and then what the water companies' responsibilities are, I mean, what's wrong with desalination? You've talked about it a little bit, and David did as well, I think.
I think we probably agree. Costs.
Yes, I mean, they are the energy hungry.
They are so energy intensive.
Yeah.
It's expensive.
Yeah.
They're expensive to build, expensive to run. On the other hand, they are, in quotes, climate change independent. So you've got a rather secure supply, and that's why they're becoming attractive, because water companies see them as providing a base load that isn't going to be affected by climate so much.
Okay, so you're sort of ruling those out, and I think I would tend to, not completely perhaps,
kind of
I would tend to agree
wholesale.
with you. I think there are other options we should explore first. One of the ones that we haven't talked about very much is the idea of moving water around the country, and James, you mentioned this. I mean, one of the problems with that is that you import all sorts of, you import water with different chemical and biological characteristics, say from upland Wales through the Midlands down into the southeast. And that's ecologically very damaging, isn't it?
Depends what water you are moving around. So we've got the Grand Union Canal scheme in our water resources management plan, and that's using outflows from in the West Midlands and just using the canal to transport it down towards the southeast. So it's not
actually using Minworth sewage treatment works effluent, isn't it?
So the West Midlands effluent is supplying the southeast.
I thought
guys.
You'd enjoy that. Yeah.
Enjoy that.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's highly treated as it
not,
comes out
not
of
directly
effluent.
either. Not directly.
And obviously, it's then within the Grand Union Canal, it's then it's treated to all the relevant standards at the other end. So that's one example. So it's not we're taking it out of an environment and causing damage in that way. So
but I mean, we recycle our water all the while already. Here in London, how many times has the water been taken out of the Thames, used and put back in again, and taken out again and put back in again?
They used to say 2.5 sets of kidneys.
They did say that, but that was wrong. But it sounds good, doesn't it? But the point is we do it. We don't shout about it necessarily because it can be quite emotive. But interbasin transfers, very challenging because of the things you were saying.
Does it tend to be opposed by people, or is it something that's more readily accepted, do you think?
I think the sewage effluent side of it may be opposed because people get the wrong end of the stick, what that actually means. But I think those that think more carefully about the things you were talking about there, particularly the quality, and then the impact of changing water onto another environment and so on is very tricky to do safely.
So you're right. People will get different compositions of water. It's all treated to the same standards, so there's no health implications. But people will in those situations potentially notice differences. So it's going to be how do we communicate with people the reason for what we're doing and why we're doing it, and what impact it may have. So there'll be tastes and odours that might be slightly different. But
I was thinking more actually about the ecological impacts rather than whether you could taste a difference, although you may well be right. I'm looking at London's water in a whole new light now. Most of the large claims are associated with large and infrequent flood events. And what I'm interested in from all of you really is whether we can actually do much about those. Now, clearly, Sue, you talked about sustainable drainage systems. Jim mentioned about catchment management and so on. When you read the press, what people seem to be interested in is things like dredging rivers, and beavers is another thing. These smaller scale interventions, can they actually do anything to reduce, let's say, the insurable losses? Sue, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, I think the issue is that the scale of what you have to do in terms of retrofitting is massive. And, we would be donkey's years in trying to do that. And what we see is happening now is that there are different organisations doing an amount of work. So like we're doing work with some water companies where they're having interventions in terms of retrofitting in some of the urban areas. We're doing work in schools in particular. You'd be surprised the number of schools that flood. There's whole programmes on SUDS in schools in terms of retrofitting. So the issue is that it is, as we've always said, it's all the time and everywhere. And actually, depending on how the rain falls and the intensity with which it falls in a particular place, you may even within the area of a particular town find one part of it that floods particularly badly and others that don't, just because of what's happened at the time. So I think we're doing quite a lot in the urban environment, but nothing like what we're likely to need if we are going to see more prolonged and intense rainfall events, because it is the speed at which it happens that we just can't cope with that capacity. Long, slow events are much easier to deal with than that volume all at once.
Jim, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, there are a couple of kind of distinctions to make here. One is there are sometimes quite different solutions depending on the scale of the flood event that you're talking about. And the second point is that the amount of effort that can be expended to address the most severe flood events depends very much on where you are. So on the first point, what I'm saying is that pretty much everywhere experiences relatively frequent and harmful, but possibly not devastating in their extent, flood events, in particular surface water flood events. And so that points to doing as many things as one possibly can, and this is what Sue is pointing to and what we've talked about in terms of sustainable drainage systems, to slow the flow and to reduce the impact of those events. Then at the other end of the scale, we've got the very large scale, either large scale inundations of river floodplains or storm surges coming up the Thames estuary and along the east coast of this country, which have the potential, if one did not have the types of flood protection that we have at the moment, to inundate entire cities, pretty much all of London, for example, in a very severe storm surge if we didn't have the Thames barrier and all the other Thames tidal defences. That type of event is statistically very rare, though actually they're occurring, large surges have occurred since the 1953 floods, which caused so much damage in London. But one can only justify doing the type of engineering, for example, that goes into the Thames barrier and the Thames tidal defences in the most densely populated urban areas. And so one needs to kind of think about what is the tolerable level of risk in different contexts and what types of intervention are appropriate given that tolerable level of risk.
And what do you think that tolerable level of risk is, Jim?
Yeah, so there are some kind of different ways of arriving at the answer to that question. The conventional way is to weigh up the losses that we're expecting in a broad sense. Sometimes a pound value is associated with that, but as Paul has said, that pound value in a way is a proxy for all of the categories of loss. And to weigh that up with the cost of how much it would cost to reduce the risk. This is the kind of cost-risk reduction trade-off. And for the most part, that's the type of reasoning we need to apply. There are, however, we might wish as society to kind of apply a threshold. Are there instances, even if it's relatively small numbers of people, so the kind of total loss is relatively small, do we say, well, this is just unacceptable for anyone to have to incur? And so that's more a kind of individual risk threshold, and we might, and in some senses, the Commission has asked for flood protection standards, and that leads to that kind of rationale, that people have reasonable expectations of what they should or should not be exposed to. So that says less about this cost-benefit trade-off and more about a discussion around what is or is not kind of reasonable for people to accept. So those are two ways of approaching an answer to your question.
If I can press you really hard, I mean, if you're a resident of Tewkesbury, for example, do you think it's acceptable to be flooded, every 10th year or 1 year in 10 randomly? Or is that,
I mean, and actually, Paul probably knows more about Tewkesbury than I do. But the other, in a sense, what this gets us towards is also a version of that cost-benefit calculation in the sense that what's it actually feasible to do? There you've got an old town. There's not much room to maneuver. Since actually 2007, there's been much more attention to using temporary and demountable defences there. So in any particular context, one really needs to get kind of quite creative in terms of what the solutions are, irrespective of how much they might actually cost. Paul, do you want to say more about Tewkesbury?
Well, we typically design our river flood defences in the UK for historical reasons, to protect ourselves against the event that happens on average once every 100 years. So something that's got an annual probability of 1%. That's a kind of a convention that has arisen. So if you were a Tewkesbury resident, our standard engineering of flood defences would, on average, lead you to bearing a risk of being flooded once in a century. That's what as a society, we've deemed that's the acceptable risk that a householder should bear. The problem is that some people are flooding a lot more frequently than that. And some of the estates that were built at Tewkesbury, particularly during the 60s and 70s, are in areas which flood more frequently.
And now, as I drove past the other day, seeing what is said to be a wonderfully beautiful shopping mall being built in the floodplain.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you can build there if you defend it, but I would argue, and have argued very strongly, that the thing that we should do is not make the problem worse.
How extreme is the problem of water pollution in our rivers, and does it actually matter? Do you want to have a go at that first, Peter? I think I've caught your
I think I think it depends on the part of the country you're in. And like I said, I've been able to do intensive study of some water companies. Others, I don't know so much. So it's difficult for me to say, for instance, very much about Severn Trent, who are the most secret of all the companies. Whereas in Wessex, who are exceptionally good at providing information, by comparison, they've got a lot of problems down there. The particular problem they have, for instance, down there is that they have a lot of groundwater, because of the geology. And so even when it stops raining, the groundwater is still high, and they have pipes that have got cracks and leaks in them. It gets in, and the system carries on. The sewage works are overburdened still, even when it stopped raining. So they end up, spilling, and their rivers, are damaged as a result. So you'll get these particular problems like that. I don't know much about Wales. The Thames region, I think, I know most about. And I would say the rural rivers are really in a bad state, and they act as an extension of the sewage works, basically. They're being used to clean up what's coming out of the sewage works, and so by the time it gets to the Thames, they've actually cleaned it up for the Thames. So the Thames is getting less of a blow than it would do normally.
So it matters, you're saying?
Absolutely matters, yeah.
Okay. Richard, do you want to have a stab at that?
I agree. I definitely think it matters. I think the challenge we've got, one of the biggest challenges we've got in agriculture is that we're working with the outdoors, and the outdoors doesn't do what you want it to do when you want it to do it. And I can tell you from first-hand experience, weather forecasting is not getting better. It is getting considerably worse. And I've been caught out by this. I've, on a Friday night, thought, I'm not going to carry on until dark. I can finish this in the morning, and woken up in the morning and it's pissing down. Sorry. And
it's raining heavily.
It's raining heavily. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that I find quite curious, I get those three, let's put the plant protection products to one side, because they are not natural. But the movement of nutrients is a natural process. We've just added to it. The movement of sediments, 70% of the global rocks are sedimentary rocks, is a natural process. We're just exacerbating it. So there's no doubt, for the reasons I said at the beginning, it makes financial sense to the farmer to keep this on farm. Which does beg the question that that's probably one of the reasons why it's such a challenge, because we don't want this to happen. And the farming community understands that it's not a good thing, but it seems to be blooming difficult to completely eliminate it. I just made a note here as well that we're a very densely populated country, and we're very demanding We've got a very demanding society. And I do think that there's a responsibility across the board. If you want to pay less for milk than you will do for water in the Sainsbury's across the road or whatever supermarket you've got, then that has a cost attached to it. And a friend, a nearby farmer, he's got a dairy herd, and the regulation has changed, so he now has to have slurry storage for 6 months for his dairy herd. And the investment that was going to be needed on his farm of 350 cows, which is fairly decent size, was $500,000. He was going to have to borrow the money, so let's eliminate the interest costs that would be applied to that. It was going to cost him, we worked it out, back of an envelope stuff, 2p per litre for every litre he produced for 7 years. There is not a supply chain in this country that he could go to and say, I need another 2p a litre in order to be able to just comply with the regulation. And that is an unbelievable challenge, and we've had that situation for decades. So that's why the slurry investment scheme, welcome though it is, currently has put about 70 million in the 2 tranches that have gone forward. It needs to be nearer 2 billion that's going to be needed. Then we're going to need the companies to be able to install them. Then we're going to need the planning authorities to say, that's okay, we don't mind you putting in a bigger structure there. So there's an awful lot of things that we need to get over to. I'm not trying to make it sound difficult, but it's just about the reality on the ground.
So just to pick up a point you made towards the beginning there, you're saying that milk is actually cheaper than water in the supermarket?
Yes, yeah, bottled water. I was on a panel yesterday and somebody else used that, so I've just recycled it, like the nutrition.
So it must be true, it must be true. We'll all go away and check that one. I mean, 2p a litre sounds like not very much, I have to say, but...
They work on very tight margins.
Yeah.
A lot of dairy producers are producing below the cost of production. Don't ask me how they do it. It must be soul destroying. 7 days. Nobody else would work 7 days a week, the hours that they put in to make such minimal returns. It really must be very difficult. I'm not a dairy farmer, but I do feel for them.
I think that the government investment from DEFRA you were talking about is this £74 million for
Yes.
slurry infrastructure that was announced a few days ago, is that? Or perhaps a little bit longer?
They repeated it. There was a round back end of last year and back end of the year before, so there's been 2 rounds,
Right,
massively oversubscribed.
I mean, I was again reading up on the statistics on this, and what I read, so therefore it must also be true, 69% of livestock farmers breached the Environment Agency limits on releasing animal waste in English rivers. 69%. So that's
you're
problematic,
stretching to
isn't it?
areas that I'm not totally comfortable with.
Okay.
But if you're thinking of the freedom of information that the Rivers Action Group got, the inspections that have increased, and understandably
Yes.
so. We want to see them being used as a way to encourage farmers to understand where they can make improvements and improve water quality. Now, you can fail on something that can be sorted out on the day that the inspection takes place. So it's not quite as clear cut as it was, and it was 2/3, wasn't it?
69%, the figure
yeah.
was. That I
But
saw, yeah.
there's a guy who I know he failed because he hadn't written something down.
Okay.
So, but it's
So
not to
there's
say
some-
that there
you
aren't.
think there's
It's not to say
statistics-
that there aren't going to be some far bigger
Okay.
issues within there. But let's work, given the circumstances that farmers find themselves in. Let's work with them to identify where the problem is and address it, and give them the support to do
Okay,
so.
we might come back to that working with in a minute. But can I just, Peter, can I just ask you, just to take an overview very briefly on who, on balance, is responsible for the problems in our rivers? I mean, there's a balance, isn't there, between different groups of people. Farmers being one.
I'm sorry to repeat what I said before. It is regional. So in the Thames area, there's no doubt it's the sewage company. We're pretty sure about that. There's not a lot going. There's not as much, for instance, as compared to say in the River Wye going into our rivers from farms. It's primarily going in the sort of polluting components of sewage going in from the sewage works. Can I actually, while you've asked me that, can I add something extra to the previous one? Because it occurred to me, and it's something I flagged in my opening remarks. There are some things that you can see in rivers, like the algal blooms, which are a result of phosphates and the like, nutrients, as Richard refers to them, getting in and then causing algal blooms. Even Lake Windermere, you've seen recently, suffers from it. But there are things that you can't see. So microplastics I mentioned. If you treat sewage properly, 95% of microplastics are taken out of the sewage. Of course, that would go on to the sewage sludge, which is sold to farmers and goes onto the land. So the microplastics can get into food chains that way. If you don't treat the sewage properly, and this is very much the work of Jamie Woodward, a professor at Manchester University, he showed that what happens is that 95% just goes out into the river silt and embeds itself there in the river silt. And then when you get a very big storm, it gets washed out to sea. And he's got records of river silt microplastics going back 60 years, which absolutely amazed me. I didn't think plastics were around in clothing and the like, but it's the synthetics that were used, all those years ago. So are microplastics damaging? We've all got microplastics in our body, in our tissues, which could be causing problems we don't know yet. Microplastics, when they get into the sea, the action of ultraviolet light and the waves makes them go smaller and they become nanoplastics. Nanoplastics are small enough to cross the placenta. So unborn animals being exposed to nanoplastics. What do nanoplastics do? They cause inflammatory responses. So you get, for instance, in the testes of some sea animals, the production of sperm is down. So you don't kill them, but you stop them reproducing. Nanoplastics are also small enough to interfere with something called methylation. Now, because I worked with a lot of genetics people in the past, I know a little bit about methylation. So the nanoplastics are physically small enough to interfere with the molecular structure of DNA. And so they can interfere with the switching on and off of genes, which is what methylation does. So not long after conception, that's when these things like methylation happen. So they could potentially be interfering with that.
So big problems that you think we're storing up and we don't even yet know about.
Exactly. So we haven't studied them enough. But there's evidence to show that these things are happening. And certainly inflammatory responses, even in human testes, have been shown. So.
Okay.